Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Howard Coombs. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for International and Defence Policy. Today we have with us Team Rubicon Canada's Chief Operating Officer, Steve Macbeth, known to many who are here today online and in the room. Steve is a former officer of the Canadian Army and New Zealand Defence Force. He has multiple deployments with the Canadian Armed Forces to Bosnia and Afghanistan, and while in New Zealand, spearheaded the COVID-19 military response. He has commanded from platoon to battalion and been a staff officer in numerous capacities. Steve also has the honor of being awarded the Canadian Meritorious Service Medal for acts that bring great credit to Canada, not once, but twice. Steve is also a past visiting defense fellow of the Center for International and Defense Policy. And today, Steve will present on bridging the gap between framework and action, providing disaster relief capacity with skilled volunteers. On behalf of the Center and as Director, Senator Hugh Siegel, I would like to welcome Steve back to Queen's University.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Howard. I'll just make sure that I get the tech right. I think now we're good to go. Okay, so first of all, thank you everybody that took their lunch hour and a bit other time to come and talk today. What I'll offer is, first of all, a disclaimer. I'll provide a practitioner's opportunity or a practitioner's view on this kind of problem set, specifically using the platform of Team Rubicon Canada to look at the volunteer base within Canada, maybe some of the capacity issues that the Canadian Forces are facing, and then maybe what are some of the options that we could look at to start to solve some of those issues. From a pure emergency management perspective, I'll just stay at the federal level, and I won't dive down into provincial or municipal because we start to get very complex. And for me, I'm just at the start of my understanding of the problem set, and so I'm kind of using this to initiate a discourse on the humanitarian workforce, volunteers, and specifically use of veterans in a skilled workforce inside of those pieces. But before we start, I guess, while they give you a good piece, I'll give you a quick 30 seconds of Team Rubicon. And there we go. And so as we go, really kind of the aim, we'll talk through our aim and intersection, and really the intersection of the problems that we'll be describing. I'll look at the increased demand for service of Canadians impacted by disaster. As we all know, whether there is a discussion on climate or climate change, the climate is impacting Canada and Canadians to the tune of billions of dollars and changing lives every season. And so it's something that probably we have to look as demand goes up, how are we going to look to fill that demand? We'll look a little bit at the present policy, the frameworks that exist at the federal level, and specifically SSE, tasks that lie within it for the Canadian Armed Forces, and then what does that look like from right now the view of the CDS, and what is he publicly stating in terms of capacity, and what is the impact of a focus on disaster and humanitarian disaster relief on the Canadian Forces right now. And then really a question, the Red Cross CEO was quoted as saying, hey, maybe this is a civilian problem. Maybe this isn't a military problem. But what does that look like if you're using a volunteer force? What does that look like if you're trying to utilize skilled or unskilled volunteers? And who can generate mass to the perspective of what the Army can bring to bear, at least with one IRU or two IRUs, for those of you that are in the audience that understand that set of about 130 to 150 soldiers in under 48 hours, who can respond at that speed? So what are the gaps that we have to identify as a volunteer and humanitarian force to do that? I'll then go into a kind of a detail of who are we, Team Rubicon, just a basic intro so you can see how does our assets, our training and our background kind of fit into those gaps that we're talking about. And then we'll talk about that intersection again of Team Rubicon, that intersection I believe of Veterans Affairs, D&D, and public safety, and emergency readiness really from those ministerial perspectives. And then finally, we'll look at an Australian model. Interestingly, there was a Team Rubicon Australia, and their government has decided to kind of take it a different way, and maybe it's a model that we can look at because there are a lot of similarities between Australia and Canada in terms of dispersed or very concentrated population and the dispersed open space and the impact of disasters on that dispersed population. Some final thoughts, and what I really want out of this, if I can from both those online and here in the room, is just discussion. Because I'm looking to kind of start to build towards a better understanding, both for my organization and really to be able to, as we work inside of our NGO alliances, be able to bring some of these thoughts into those groups so that we can really approach government with a more nuanced perspective to be able to move forward. Okay, great. So there's no doubt in terms of increasing demand. On the right, you see impacts of floods in British Columbia. And we have disasters are increasing in frequency and severity across Canada. This is both reflected in kind of specifically emergency management academic literature presently, but more importantly, it's recognized by our government that both those two terms, frequency and severity, are those two pieces that are starting to come to bear against the population. If you look at 195 major disasters identified by the Canadian Disaster Database between 2008 and 2018, and of course since 2018, we've had a number of significant disasters, most recently with Hurricane Fiona hitting the East Coast quite hard, and we know that come this spring, we'll likely face another round of flood and fire. Combined, all these disasters are in the cost of tens of billions of dollars. I believe Fiona was the most expensive disaster we've had to date. And it's displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and due to increased scale, will outstrip local provincial resources quickly. This is exacerbated in Canada because there's many population bases or already vulnerable populations that are underinsured. And so we don't just have the initial response, the recovery, the sandbagging, but post these events, we see that there are major percentages of the Canadian population that are underinsured, and it's an area that Team Rubicon takes an interest in as a charity to help to work those forward. There we go. Okay, so on your left, you see there's a young woman on your left with her hood up. It's a cold day in northern Nova Scotia in Sydney. That member of Team Rubicon is an ex-military medic with multiple deployments overseas and is presently a firefighter in a major city. On her own time, she takes time to go out to help the rest of Canada work on disasters. You can see the lineup of major hydro trucks from around the country lined up to be able to start to restore power to the 750,000 Nova Scotians that were without power at that time. It's an example to try to articulate and understand from a visual perspective of the integration of the non-governmental actor, and both within this team were military, police, fire, the hydro teams, and multiple NGOs looking to support that effort. And so our aim today is really to consider a path to nationally mobilize resources and look at skilled volunteers to increase national capacity, domestic disasters and humanitarian crisis. And so again, we talk specifically about the big scale disasters. What we should also consider is those emergent humanitarian issues that we face in Canada at times with food security, the COVID crisis, inoculations and vaccines, all pieces that Team Rubicon has helped over the last couple of years. And you'll see that we started to shift specifically away from just disaster relief to that humanitarian workforce or workspace. So considerations as we go through the discussion, I think climate and the humanitarian crisis. So what does that mean to have that increased demand? 2, CAF fatigue. I won't speak for the CAF. I can only go off what the news reports and open source has and statements from the CDS. But with the multiple requirements on the CAF, the admitted personnel shortages or hardships of recruiting, and then the increased demand, there seems to be a nexus here in terms of what does that mean for their HADAR ability to respond, and if not them, then who? And then response. Well, a requirement for a force, whether that's a national force or a series of local forces that can scale nationally and respond locally at speed. What do I mean by that? I mean that if there is a disaster in a site, often folks or volunteers that are in that area are also impacted by a disaster. Why do you need to be able to scale nationally? So you can take resources from other periods. So most of our responders to Nova Scotia were BC, Alberta, and Ontario. Why? Because those folks were fresh and able to respond, while the folks that did great work in the first moments of the disaster in Halifax were able to then take care of their families and then come back online as the disaster evolved. And so think about that volunteer base. Although we always like to look and focus locally, we kind of think about solving locally but scaling nationally. And then we'll talk a little bit about veteran underemployment. It's not really in the EM space, but it is an issue that seems to be emergent. And I think there may be a pipeline or a hope that we can take something that we've already invested in, years and millions of dollars of training, and maybe reinvest that back into our emergency management space at like little cost, as opposed to a full train. It's more of a top up to get people back and into the fight. And then finally, what are those obstacles to scale? And then the Australian model. And that's how we'll kind of roll through. So I kind of look at it through the intersection of interest and capability. And so really from an emergency management perspective, we have the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness. Those two are very easy. They both have mandates and mandate letters, specifically one to prepare the nation for emergency, and two, the Minister of Public Safety owns all the mechanisms to be able to respond and aggregate resources to be able to assist in that. They also have the inroads with all the NGO alliances. and really work through those pieces to be able to support Canadians once they're in trouble. The Minister of National Defence, if we look at it through that lens as the action arm of the federal government, or the deployed action arm that's come forward, working in conjunction under a request for assistance. And then the Minister of Veterans Affairs. And I put in the Minister of Veterans Affairs because I believe that there might be an opportunity for a workforce or for a volunteer force based off of the number of veterans that are leaving right now, and a training opportunity to be able to help people transition back out into those things. So in my model, in this instance, at a small level, I'll put Team Rubicon in the center of that because I believe there's a nexus as an organization that's secular and not politically aligned, has a background in emergency management and military veteran-led organization. We can help the ministers look to solve a small piece of the problem. We're not a panacea, we're not gonna solve the whole problem, nor are we gonna be able to scale to the level of the military. But we can take a chunk of the problem and solve some of those pieces. And so I saw the Minister of Public Safety, Minister of Emergency Preparedness as like a prepare and deploy and employ. The Minister of Veterans Affairs, we could look at interaction with them from an enable, employ, and training perspective for veterans. And then finally, for the Ministry of National Defence, we're looking to assist in reducing capability on that higher demand, and potentially, as opposed to a lead, they look to an enable function with those unique skill sets they have, whether it be airlift or what have you, specific medical care that they can provide only at scale. And so that's how I'm kind of couching the conversation as we move forward. Legislation backdrop, federal legislation, Emergency Management Act, the Emergencies Act, Public Order for Emergency, and then obviously the Canadian National Defence Act. It's important to note that the National Defence Act has recently gone through a review, and for the most part, domestic operations are going to go through Crown prerogative, mostly by the executive, rather than official request to the National Defence Act, and I think that's a unique perspective that we should take on board. But if we leave the legislation aside and the legal frameworks and kind of look at the frameworks and strategies that the federal government is using right now, is one that was initiated in 2007 and then refreshed in 2017 is the Emergency Management Framework for Canada. Following out of that is the Emergency Management Strategy for Canada towards a Resilient 2030, and then the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Emergency Management Strategy Interim Action Plan. And so you see framework, strategy, plan, and therefore we should be able to see fairly concise execution. Whether or not that's true right now is probably open for debate, and it's probably the talk, is a whole other talk, specifically on policy. And lastly, strong, secure, engaged just uses a backdrop so that I could better understand the role of Canadian forces in domestic response and the role of Canadian forces as tasked inside of those tasks through SSE. As we get into the framework then, it's important to understand that Canada signed up for what's called the Sendai Framework based out of the UN disaster response. This basically is a large framework signed on by 187 countries and adopted, and basically lays out, there's a couple of basic principles from a disaster response perspective that Canada has signed on to, and therefore our strategies, our frameworks, and our plans all descend out of the Sendai Framework, and it's heavily denoted. The one exception is Quebec, where they've maintained the previous framework adopted by the UN and haven't moved to the Sendai Framework as of yet. But it is a good example inside Canada as a nation where we start to see, just in terms of how we're acting our plans and the federal way of executing, that even at the do we accept the plan, there's already a fissure as we start to look at the provincial levels, and that follows it all the way down. So from the Sendai Framework, basically we lay out a governance model, and that governance model lays out essentially how you work through your decision making. What's important to note here is that although NGOs sit at the table, or they have a national council that are they're not a decision-making body and they're not directly tasked. There's a kind of a backdoor access through the government operations center, and then we work through those pieces. NGOs do not self-deploy, and so essentially there has to be an invite out, and then that can slow down the process by which the speed the NGOs can get in. And so that's a governance model based off of those pieces. The next one is the Emergency Management Strategy for Canada. What I'd ask you to take away from this is that it's a whole of society approach. And this is where we really start to see, as we transition to plan, is how are we going to integrate it? These are fantastic frameworks. It's a whole of society, seeks to leverage existing knowledge and capabilities to empower and strengthening the resilience for all. What does that mean from a funding model? What does that mean within an execution model? And how do we start to build those out? And then lastly, into our emergency management strategy for an interim action plan. Out of the 5 top priorities, the one that really applies to NGOs that have proprietary or have the ability to execute on the ground is 1, understanding of pan-Canadian flood risk, access to, it looks like there's going to be delivery of a Trans-Canada communication system, and then advanced efforts for improving disaster recovery programming. And so where does that programming fit? Who has access to the programming? And then how do we scale that programming as it sits right now? And if there isn't a CAF in a big way, what does that mean for these plans? And so now we've kind of gone from the UN through our federal levels all the way down, and then we should probably have an understanding of what does a tactical response look like on the ground. And so on the left-hand edge, level of effort, on the bottom, time. Essentially, resilience, business as usual across the top until an incident. You drop off at that point in time, you have an initial response, and then once you have that response, you overlay that response and recovery, and then community restoration and resilience. This model's been adapted from the Introduction to Emergency Management in Canada by Collins and Blackburn, and so is a fantastic resource for any of you that are interested in that type of thing. What's important, I think, here are the gaps. So during resilience, Canada is a massive nation with different levels of capability. Municipalities are responsible for that first level of resilience and understanding. A lot of it is done either through an interim training provided by the province, if it can be funded, or provided by NGOs. So there's a gap there and a gap in understanding of where are these smaller municipalities resilient, and that investment into our disparate or maybe populations that are outside of the bubbles of major population. Secondly, during that time of the incident, if we look at it from a storm, major storm perspective, where we understand storm track, that disaster minus 48 hours to disaster plus 5 days, there is a series of events that occur there. Municipalities and provinces are ultimately responsible in that first phase until an RFA goes up, and so there's a natural delay in response. And so there's a short gap there in that space between incident and response as people are starting to come online. As a case study from a Fiona perspective, because a lot of the operations look at DFAA, which is the funding model from a federal level, they look to see how much money they have, and they'll be able to figure out how much they can respond. This is something that where charities fit in quite well, because you can go forward, utilize your own resources initially, knowing that you're not going to be remunerated necessarily by DFAA, and be in a position to help in that first 24 to 48 hours should you be invited in by the province and you have that level of coordination. But right now that level of coordination is either done through an NGO alliance or is done through personal commitment and contacts that you build during the resilience phase. Response and recovery. During this phase, after the immediate response is done, the news cameras have moved on, the Army has left, the contractors have started to move on. This is where communities continue to need to respond. There are still projects ongoing for the Derico storms that happened last year. There's obviously a ton of recovery still going on for Fiona. And so before you even get to the next disaster cycle, you're still recovering from the last one. And then that long tail of community restoration and resilience, what does getting back to normal mean? And that cannot just mean physically. There's socioeconomic, psychological impacts that come along with disasters. And then how do we improve the resilience, and is there the money or the will to continue to do that? And so each of these 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the small gaps that perhaps charities, NGOs, humanitarian workforces from across Canada can be of assistance when larger organizations can't necessarily take the time or can't fit into those seams. So I'll move then from an understanding of kind of the federal level of policy and the basic response as we see it to kind of the Canadian Forces as it stands right now. So there's no negotiating that the in strong, secure, and engaged domestic response is a core mission set to provide assistance to civil authorities, non-governmental partners in responding to international and domestic disasters or major emergencies. And lastly, the Canadian Forces is mandated to respond concurrently to multiple domestic emergencies in support of civilian authorities. Those are both very large bills, depending on what you're looking at during what disaster cycle, how many brigades you have on the table. When you're adding now a new Indo-Pacific strategy, a strategy for the Arctic, a greater deployment into Europe, and always the unknown thing that's just sitting out there. And so the CDS has been quite clear in its first instance as when he was the Army commander, to basically said this could be a danger if we get too solely focused. At the time, the Army was responding in a big way to COVID and had been responding to other disasters, because he believed that it's when the country really needs us to do what armies do, we're going to end up shortchanging on that resource. That's actually open, I'm sure, for debate on what the role of the Army is, and that's the national debate that's going on right now. My thought here isn't to break down that part. It's actually to say, if there is a shortage from a Canadian Forces perspective, who is the right types of elements to start to be resourced and pushed into that space to be able to help Canadians on their worst day. So how do we understand the problem then? And so from a report on Parliament since 2010, there's been a dramatic increase in RFAs. So between 2010 and 2016, there's kind of 2 per year. When we look at 2017 to 2021, we look at 4 per year. And then 2021 and up, we start to get to 7 per year. And so we're kind of seeing this like growth by 2. And this is not including the 118 RFAs that were utilized for the pandemic response. Interestingly, on the webpage, on the Lentis webpage, the Canadian Forces is pretty clear on how they see this problem set and what the perception is of this constant request for assistance. And so although the Canadian Forces stated we're always ready to respond, they don't want to be the first to respond when it occurs. They want the provincial and territorial authorities to expend all resources before they do that. And then, as a last resort, they want you to be able to do that. The Canadian Forces are finite and should only be involved when their organization has the capacity to respond. I found that very interesting that on the Lentis website, that's a very clear message from the Canadian Armed Forces as to where their priorities lie. And although they are capable of responding, they see lots of other capacity, but who? Because I think it's about that general labor, the uniforms on the ground, the feeling of security that the Army brings when disaster strikes. And so who is that? And that's what we're talking about today. And so we go through and kind of finish off in there in terms of Hurricane Fiona. And this is where there's very public military response to recruiting challenges, facing foreign conflicts. The CDS has come back and he worries about readiness. And that specifically disaster relief is a threat to the Canadian Army's fighting edge, stated the commander. And so these kind of messages from uniformed members, from leaders within the Canadian Forces, paints a very specific picture as to where the CAF is. It doesn't release them from the task in SSE, but it's a very clear message publicly that General Lair believes that it's part of a broader issue in the CAF's evolution over the years from a resource of last resort to a force of first choice that going forward needs to be addressed in a national context. Interestingly, that reflects the words of Lentis, which I guess it should because it's the commander's words. But what's the plan? In none of the frameworks, the plans, nor the strategies that I laid out earlier, was there one mention of force design. There's been a series of questions of who could it be? Is it a Canadian FEMA? Or does that just create too much bureaucracy? And in fact, the authorities don't exist within Canada to be able to push that down and into provinces. Is it a larger humanitarian workforce as was deployed through COVID, which had some success, but leaves a lot of people on the outside because there's very specific pieces that allow organizations to join that humanitarian workforce. Christian Leprec from Queens, I believe, or RMC, laid out that he believes there should be a specialty military force in an article in 2021. And so there's a lot of opinion, and so I guess my opinion would be in between. I believe that there's a hybrid model that exists between a paid element that is not necessarily federal government. The federal government already has agreements with charities like the Red Cross. You see where they match dollar for dollar on Red Cross responses. And you have a hybrid paid and volunteer force that is able to move forward to be able to respond to these pieces. And so I think that's the next part of the question is who is it? How does it get designed? And what does that force generation look like to be able to help Canadians on their worst day? So we'll look to develop some capacity. And this is where we look to use Team Rubicon as partnering with skilled volunteers within that spectrum of response from resilience through response to recovery and then back to resilience again. So our mission, Team Rubicon is a veteran-led humanitarian organization that serves global communities before, during, and after crises. There are 3 entities to Team Rubicon USA, Team Rubicon Canada, and Team Rubicon International. US and Canada works very closely across North American borders. We sit at, like the US Army loses, or the US military loses 200,000 a year. They sit at about 120,000 volunteers right now. we sit at 2,500 to 2,800 volunteers at the moment nationally. And so the scales are much like the Canadian Army and the military, the US Army scales. But it's important to note that we access each other across borders. For anybody who saw the young man that came in just before this started off, he's a gray shirt and deployed down to Kentucky to the Kentucky floods to be able to help out down there. And they reciprocate with that capacity and mass to move forward. So our origins in Canada. The origins based out of Fort McMurray, known as the Beast, would spread over 1.5 million acres, destroying homes and replacing thousands of residents. Two young Canadian soldiers who had deployed down to the US and had built an interest and inroads with Team Rubicon USA, looked to develop the same thing here in Canada. Within days, they had 80 volunteers that stayed for an extended period of time, ranging from Australia, the UK, the United States, to bring kind of muscle and compassion to the problem that was for the Fort McMurray problem. And that's essentially the catalyst that drove Team Rubicon forward in the mission to be able to help Canadians on their worst day. So the two communities that we serve, and it's important, why did I bring in Veterans Affairs into this discussion that was essentially about policy and response? Well, number one in our priority is the communities that we serve in Canada. Those communities around that are suffering on any given day, and those people and populations that may be more vulnerable than others that we look to target to be able to support them that can effectively receive those charity services. And then our gray shirts. We believe specifically that community and identity and purpose help the Canadian veteran. That the Canadian veteran with those three things is equipped to move forward and actually feed back in to the Canadian population. They're well trained, they've been well led, we've invested money in them, and those skill sets, once they depart the forces, don't have to go stagnant. There are parts, and they want to continue to have a mission to go. And so we believe that this is part of veterans' wellness. There's a nuance here in that we don't see ourselves as a veterans service organization and that we provide service to veterans. We see our veterans providing service. And so although similar, a bit different. And that with community, identity, and purpose, these three aspects allow us then to create cohesive teams based off of veteran populations, emergency responders, firefighters, police, ambulance, and some awesome, highly skilled civilians that decide to join the team that are highly motivated to help Canadians when disaster strikes. We're able to move across all the services that are required. Mitigation services, whether that be going in early to provide reconnaissance, provide advice to communities, the beginnings of the wildfire mitigation pieces, preparedness to include training, provision of the ICS or Incident Command System training as a service provision, understanding how to prepare communities, providing those briefings as we move forward, and then obviously response to include command and control, fairly advanced command and control capabilities, particularly leveraging our police, fire, and senior military members within the command and control space to support those provinces and municipalities when they're working through their high-end cycle, and then recovery. And so this allows us, that not only provides that back to our community, but we know that we're supporting the Canadian community. As a quick snapshot across the missions, we've just passed the 100 mission. So if you think between 2016 and 2022, that's 100 missions across Canada. Not all at the scale of Fort McMurray or Fiona or those other pieces, but 100 missions in terms of continuing to support and move forward. Tweed, Ontario is the last one that's noted there. Post-Tweed, Ontario, we deployed for over 2.5 months into PEI and Nova Scotia to respond to Fiona. And so how do we fill the gaps? Well, filling the gaps in terms of understanding each of those pieces that come together from a level of effort and in terms of the incident. Because Team Rubicon has the ability to conduct reconnaissance, to disaster map, to prepare and to deploy on short notice, and we have people that are willing to live in austere conditions. We believe that our first gap that we can look to fill is both the resilience and then specifically into pre-incident through the initial stages of that incident before the larger elements of response comes in. It's not that we're not effective when the larger elements comes in, it's that we can be there first, look to set conditions, and then as we start to scale up, we could move into larger response at mass. The difference The difference being that at Mass, for example, in Nova Scotia, was looking for 300 chainsaws, and we were able to provide just under 50 chainsaws. And so if you think about the scale required for some of these disasters, it's a huge burn. Then during response to recovery, post-response, we have elements in our veteran and our volunteer community that are very interested in maybe not being in that first stage, but really connect with people as they look to recover their lives and look to unseat their property. We have a waiver system that allows us to work on private property, which is different than both provincial and federal government organizations, and allows us to connect with that homeowner. Those homeowners we specifically target are those of vulnerable populations or underinsured, to make sure that whatever insurance they have, they can put towards the rebuild. And we look to do the strip it down to the studs, for example, during floods, be able to bring out everything, strip it down to the studs, make it Team Rubicon clean, and then provide it back to that family ready for the contractors to go in to do the rebuild. And then finally, and this will be, as we start to move on, that community restoration and resilience. The US right now has started to build out their rebuild program. We're not there yet, but they have a specific rebuild program that we would look to, if we can grow to that point, to be able to start to get into that community restoration and resilience. But we will cycle always back to resilience and stay connected with these communities. Once you're involved in these communities, there's never a time that you leave them again. You stay in contact with the CAOs, with the mayors, with the emergency managers, and you start to build that network as you're moving forward. And so this is really where Team Rubicon, as skilled volunteers, can look to fill some of those tactical gaps. So one of the considerations, though, is that it's not about money, but everything costs money. And so when you look to respond locally and scale nationally, you have to understand that these folks have to be raised, trained, equipped, and maintained. So just those 4 pictures across the bottom, we have to look. So that's one of our members working in a First Nations community with a food security issue, utilizing a bit of advanced technology to be able to understand a problem a bit better. You have to train folks not from scratch, but to get those tools right in terms of understanding both cultural sensitivities, understanding how to use the technology effectively, and then how to build and lead, almost lead from behind, because it's not your response, it's the community's response. And then how do you integrate with their emergency operations center? In terms of the next picture over, that's a wildfire mitigation. That's actually Colorado. We're learning to do wildfire mitigation. This year it'll be in BC, but you have to be able to equip, move, train, feed, all the things that, for those of you that were in the military before understand, still has to occur now. Next one over is sandbagging. So early folks out into British Columbia, early days of the floods. Same thing, you're now moving folks into austere conditions. You need to understand and pay for the safety of your folks. You have to train them on safety protocols based up to all the same standardization that the province was used. There's no special rules for NGOs. You have to understand work, rest, and provide leadership. And that all comes with a training bill, an equipping bill, and then maintenance bill. And then finally, complex cuts on chainsaws. For those of you that have chainsaw experience, I know that one member of the room is like an expert pioneer. So they'll know that they can jump out and bite. And there's a very significant training bill and safety bill that goes along with that. And we make sure that our folks go from basic through advanced training, much like you'd see in lots of other organizations. But again, we have to think about how to scale that and to scale it at a size that can maybe respond to fill some of the gaps that may be left by the Canadian Armed Forces. It'll be about how do we do that financially, how do we do that culturally, and then how do we do that to integrate best with with the other partners. And so John Blacksford called the strategic cousins. John Blacksford's a professor from Australia that did his PhD on Canada, Australia, and noted a series of similarities between the two countries. Lots of differences, but tons of similarities in terms of population density, open land mass, and then now as we get into the climate response, the amount and scale of disasters that we're dealing with, and the cost to the ADF down there, and the cost to the CAF up here. And so they looked at it a bit differently, or they looked at it how perhaps we could consider it. And they developed something called the Disaster Ready Fund. And this Disaster Ready Fund is really $1 billion between essentially 2023 to start out to improve Australia's resilience to national hazards. The response to that is they believe that if you can get money down to the folks that do the business, and you can fund those folks effectively, they will scale for you to be able to achieve that resilience. That communities, by and large, are resilient. They just actually need to be resourced. And so they look to take away a lot of the boundaries and barriers of that money to be able to access that for their resilience training. Part of that was what used to be Team Rubicon Australia, which is now Disaster Relief Australia. And through this Disaster Relief Fund, they looked at the problem set. The Australians had a similar problem. One, they were facing, most recently, they had a parliamentary investigation or cabinet minute that came out specifically about veteran suicide and veterans' issues upon departure from the Canadian Forces, or the Australian Defence Forces. So they had that as a bit of a crisis and a motivator for veterans' issues within Australia. Two, they faced massive wildfires and massive floods. And the ADF was deployed at the same time that they're facing a new threat in their region, and they're investing heavily in their ADF to be able to conduct the defense of Australia. And so they looked for a creative way to do that. Enter Team Rubicon Australia, that they look to say, okay, we're sitting at, much like Canada right now, 2,000 volunteers. We believe that if we scale to 5,000 volunteers, given that it's a 10 to 15% ability to deploy at any one time, we can provide you a reasonable response force for about $5 million a year as startup. And so they were funded out for Disaster Relief Australia to the tune of just over $38 million over the next 3 years to basically set themselves to achieve 5,000 volunteers, so give themselves about a brigade minus of deployability within Australia. And number two, to provide training and capability to Australia's veterans, because a veteran-led organization, and to create a sub-force of about 300 inside that 5,000 that would be a more rapid response force. If you think about 300, that would be a very robust immediate response unit that you would see coming out of our CMBGs right now. And so what did this buy the Australians? It bought them increased resilience. It bought them their use of their veteran skill sets that they'd had already invested in. And they had increased community participation. And most importantly, I think from an ADF perspective, it started to look like it would reduce ADF involvement. Now, early days. So 5 years from now, this may not be legitimate at all. But of course, sitting here as Team Rubicon Canada, I think it looks like a pretty good plan. And so I just offer that as we look at right now, the great models, the plans, and the strategies, the one component that we're missing is that detailed understanding of who will do the work and who will deploy forward. And so I think that now as we kind of come to the close, I believe that Team Rubicon Canada and other organizations like ours are part of the solution, but not the solution. Someone's going to have to wrap their arms around that problem set. In particular, if the Canadian Armed Forces is really setting up to not be able to be as available as they have been in the past. That said, with an executive order, they will be as engaged as they're ordered to be. But perhaps it's time to start thinking about what those next steps could be to mobilize skilled workers across Canada, and understanding from a national perspective, it may be good for our population also to look to understand our own resilience. The policy via anticipatory activities, mitigation, and whole of society is correct. Those models, whether it's the Sendai Framework and all the way through the Canadian strategies, and they say all the right things, just like whole of government operations on foreign soil. But what does it look like? And I think that that's probably the next step of study. And I'm sure there are folks out there studying it right now, but I believe that's a very interesting look at starting to pull apart those policies and really understanding what are the action items that come out of that. And the first step is that action plan that's been published and is actually fairly robust. I believe that we do want to leverage our national veteran assets. Right now, there's a ton of stories in the news based off of either some issues of people coming out to get jobs. If you are a veteran, you receive the emails of, are you someone that hires veterans? And so I think that there's something that we could look at to how to better do that, and what time in someone's career do we start to engage it. Because it's important to note for those of you that are veterans in the room, no matter how many floods and fires you've done, if you don't have the civilian equivalency compensation or understandings, you're not as qualified as someone on the street. And so I think we need to bridge that somehow. We'd look to fund scale nationally for NGOs, and I think it's a savings. It's pennies on the dollar, the NGO money, to be able to provide a fairly robust capability. And I think with that hybrid model of both paid and full volunteers, there's elements inside that spectrum of response that we would be able to push through. And of course, we want to see a reduction on the pressure on D&D. That's my perspective. I'd like to see a reduction on it. But that's obviously open for debate as the discourse carries on. Maybe D&D is the right button to push, but that's a national debate as to what our Army is and where it's going to go for. And then finally, I think that it's at everybody at the table. Right now, there are barriers to engagement from an NGO perspective to be able to engage at the federal and national level. Again, that's probably the subject of another talk or a panel, and how do we best bring NGOs to the table to do it. And with that, that's it for me, Howard.
So I'll moderate the questions. I believe we have the capacity to take questions from online folks. And here in the room, I will pass you the mic so that you can pose your question. And I will pass in the room while we bring back the screen on the computer so I can see the questions.
Is it live, Howard? Thanks very much. Steve, thank you very much. Very interesting and very informative. Steve Taylor, Callian Group Limited. My question to you is, on your intersection diagram, you've got interest capability. Do you think somewhere and in what capacity might there be a place for the private sector? So as you know, Callian Group, veteran employer, training, health services.
Absolutely. So Callian is aggressive in the emergency management space, and I believe is in Nova Scotia right now doing that. I didn't include it in that in this because, one, I'm not an expert in it, and I wasn't trying to bring that to be. I believe that probably there's more than enough space. There's also more cost. And so that's fine. It's not about limiting private sector. It's not about taking away jobs or taking away. I think there's room for everybody inside that marketplace, because volunteers and volunteer hybrid organizations will have a limit at some point in time, and then money will solve that problem. But at some point, we're going to have to figure out how to reduce costs on disaster. And that's an idealistic way of looking at it. But I would say from an idealism perspective, I'd prefer that we figure out a way to reduce costs to the Canadian taxpayer and reduce costs to our population on disaster. And I don't know that contractors do that. I don't know. Maybe they do. And that would probably be a very interesting analysis to show that contractors are cheaper than the Canadian forces for these reasons. And I think that maybe that's the next, that would be a great paper.
And there is a greater demand on contractors, as you know.
That's right.
Given the gaps in the Canadian Armed Forces now. So.
That's right. And I think there's also when does the contractor come in? And so I think that's another issue, because is the contractor willing to live austere? Yes, no. Is the contractor able to work in small communities? Yes, no. And so I think that's why probably there needs to be a matrix system of like, what are the capabilities? What's the response time? And then who can do it? And then what does the province or the municipality be able to pay? That's one of the issues too. The municipalities, if they don't receive provincial funding, they don't have the money to respond, and it's left to charities to try to help out the best we can. And we saw that in the smaller communities in Ontario during the Derico.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve.
Hey, Steve.
Hey.
Gary Izacek. I'll also work for the Callian Group. Have you been considering participating in some of the training activities that are occurring, like thinking about being the lead for Nanook this year? We're going to the Yukon territory, and as you know, there's a plethora of organizations involved in there. Have you been considering participating in there, either in the development or the actual execution of the exercise?
So a lot of it has to do with capacity. We have a very small headquarters that runs a national organization, and so it's about how much capacity we can provide to a training event, when at the same time we may have tactical events. So right now, this year, we're trying to get involved in provincial EM readiness exercises in Alberta, Nova Scotia, and PEI. And we're looking to see how we get into BE. Yukon is someplace, because we're very interested in the north of how we take that next step, because as you know, everything's more expensive, more dispersed, and more difficult once you get there. Though we have a highly motivated group of folks that have worked up there and want to work up there again. And so if there's an invite, then we'd
because I would see like somebody, it could be just one person participating in the development of the exercise, inputting some of your resources or capacities, and then during the exercise, which is going to be about a week in Whitehorse this year, you could be part of the whole thing. But anyway.
So it's an invite. We could probably talk afterwards and see where it goes. But we're always happy to participate with any government or partner.
Steve, thanks for that. Colonel Ryan Drakowski, Canadian Armed Forces Visiting Defense Fellow here at Queen's. Huge thanks to Team Rubicon and what you've achieved and your presence in the information environment. describing to everybody what great potential is there, let alone the actual activities occurring. You'd alluded to the federal provincial initiatives. The way I'm kind of framing it here is to better formalize a civilian national humanitarian response organization, or words to that effect. Do you know where those discussions are occurring, if they are occurring, and how or what is needed to help inform those discussions?
So presently, each province has, for lack of a better term, an NGO alliance, and which is where all NGOs that operate in this space, whether you're the Salvation Army, you're able to provide, you're an NGO that can provide UAVs, whatever that you may be, you sit on this NGO alliance. From the POC, like you'd remember from working at a division, the requests come down for assistance, and then that NGO alliance looks to task out from there. At the federal level, the GOC interacts with a national alliance of NGOs that works, but to be honest, it's somewhat ad hoc. It's all volunteer based, and so the power behind those organizations varies, likely due to personality. They're fantastic people, all trying to do exactly what's right for Canada, but it's not, I guess, it hasn't had its arms wrapped around it. The one exception I think would be the humanitarian workforce that was deployed during COVID, and there's a list of things that you need to meet to be able to be part of that humanitarian workforce, and I believe it's up for reopening in March, I want to say, and I think there's a bunch of interested parties that will look to try to access or try to gain lodgement to be able to get into those discussions of what is that humanitarian workforce, because the big ones, Red Cross, do great work and they're massive scale, but there are still niches, like I was trying to show, that the smaller NGOs have a significant role to play and can have a significant impact on Canadian population. And so it's a matter of how do we all share space. Yeah, and be resourced.
And we have a couple of questions from our online audience. The first question is, on the point of what happens after the commitment to Team Rubicon Australia is completed, has there been discussions of what continued support would need to look like to maintain the force of 5,000 volunteers? From Charles-Antoine Duval.
So, Charles, right now they're responding to the injection of capital and are looking to grow themselves to the 5,000 volunteers. I'm sure they're discussing, they're still a charity, and as they scale, one thing that's common with charities is once you scale, the more responses you do, the better it is for the charity in terms of financial health, and then reinvesting that back into the charity to be able to execute. I believe, and I won't speak because there's been no official word out from the CEO or from that organization, is that they believe at 5,000 it starts to self-generate, or they'll continue to look for some interaction with the government. But there's nothing, I can't speak to Australia's plans for the next phase after the next 4 years.
And the next question is from Jeff Donaldson. Steve, has Team Rubicon considered developing social networks and connections in the resilience phase at the municipal level, specifically with high-risk communities?
Yeah, so Jeff, absolutely. That's part of the, so in the Team Rubicon design, we have a piece called metros. Each metro is whether it's in a certain area where you can aggregate gray shirts, whether that's Toronto or it's Ottawa or it's Lower Mainland BC. One of the tasks of those metros is to build relationships with the emergency managers in those areas. That has allowed us to respond faster. For example, during the Derico, the other piece is that every gray shirt's a sensor, for lack of a better term. And so we have a proprietary GISR capability for their phones. They can go out, so when the Derico hit, hey, we think there's a problem here before there's an official report, and take a picture, activate based off of that, and then look to communicate with the local emergency management. Because as you know, experts like yourself know, the first phase is actually about understanding what's going on inside the space. And so that's really where our gray shirts, as members of the community, add value on immediate activation. And yes, we work very hard to maintain relationships provincially and municipality, and it becomes just a capacity issue. And as we grow, we look to connect each of our gray shirts with a municipality.
Are there any questions from anybody in the room or from the online audience?
Thank you. So I'm South Korean Army Colonel and I'm professor at Korean Military Academy. I'm here to serve as the visiting the faculty to RMC, Department of Politics and Economics.
Yeah.
So I am asking this question to share my knowledge about South Korea. So in South Korea, there is a special unit which asks for very professionalized military skills like UDT, underwater demolition team.
Yeah.
So the veterans who have served in this unit often organize a voluntary organization to help people in the flood. So they use their specialized skills for people. But my question is, what advantage the Canadian veterans have in responding to national disaster if compared to their civilian counterpart?
So I think a couple of things. One is the ability to achieve mass quickly. Two is command and control in terms of their ability to conduct it, and then specialized skill sets, particularly that our engineers, or the Canadian Forces engineers, bring to the table. You saw on Port aux Basques, for example, a most recent example, only the Navy could have been able to approach from that direction and be able to utilize those capabilities with a hardened ship to be able to do the recovery efforts that they conducted during that disaster. And so I think the Canadian Armed Forces lives up to its name and provides excellent coverage especially. But I think the question really is, should it remain specialized? And then should we expand the civilian side so that it's not general labor? And I think that would be the question for those of us that were in Winnipeg before. There's tons of sandbags thrown. Ottawa the other year, forest fires, and I think that's the question. It's not the specialty skill sets that are in question at all, whether that's airlift, especially medevac, or the capability of the Navy. I think the question is more generalized labor to be able to help Canadians on those days. And I think that's where the discussion piece is, in my opinion only.
And we have one last question, as unfortunately our time is coming to a close, from the online audience, and it's from Bennett. I'm not sure if this is in your realm or if you're able to answer, but is there room for reaching out to other international organizations that have established humanitarian organizations? I think of NATO and their humanitarian force. Is there not room for small NGOs to reach out to these organizations directly without the government acting as a middleman? Could the government not be a check at the end to ensure the partnership both ethical and in line with the disaster relief mission?
So yes, and I think of a simple piece, we've got a border and we've got Team Rubicon USA and Team Rubicon Canada. So that's an international partner, for lack of a better term. And so there are functions from a US perspective. There are a lot of volunteers, not just in Team Rubicon, but other types of volunteers that when disaster strikes come north with some of those capabilities. And the provinces actually have very specific protocols to be able to bring those through, and say interact with the Government Operations Center, and they talk to the NGO that's going to liaise, or if it's a US NGO that's looking to come in, they do those pieces. So I think it does exist. For the most part, we have the capacity to just deal directly with our Team Rubicon incorporated partners, but I believe that other elements do leverage internationally. But I think a lot of times with the Canadian problem, we'll look to expand all the issues in Canada before we go looking outside of our borders.
Steve, I'm going to move over here. I'm not trying to crowd you,
okay.
But don't go too far because we have to stay in the screen.
Right, got it.
I just want to thank you on behalf of the audience here and online and the Center for International Defense Policy and its director, Senator Yu Siegel, for coming here and spending some of your time with us today. I know you're incredibly busy because I reach out to you on occasion. I know you're always off doing something, spreading goodness that Team Rubicon can actually do. I think what you've said here today has actually brought some new perspectives to me about disaster management and achieving coverage in gaps that we have currently in Canada that I wouldn't have really thought about unless you come here today to talk about Team Rubicon. So thank you very much for teaching me something new and for making me think about the subject in a new and innovative fashion.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.